Samwise presents Only Fools and Podcasts, an in-depth episode-by-episode guide, analysis and celebration of England's most beloved and successful sitcom. To find out more about the show, contact us at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. Lovely jubbly. Samwise presents Only Fools and Podcasts, an in-depth episode-by-episode guide, analysis and celebration of England's most beloved and successful sitcom. To find out more about the show, contact us at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. Lovely jubbly. Trigger warning, this episode does contain trigger. Au revoir and welcome to Only Fools and Podcasts, a show dedicated, as you may very well know, solely to the deification, commemoration and adulation of the world's greatest sitcom. We are of course on episode 4, the second time around. We are in the thick of it here now. And yeah, I'm pretty much just ready to dive in, really. This is another fun episode, one that I'm very familiar with. Although, come to think of it, I don't think there is an episode that I'm not familiar with. But before I get into an actual majorly scheduled digression, I just thought I'd do a bit of housekeeping. Now, on my other podcast, Down in the Hole, we have a great email response. Every week we have 2 or 3 fantastic emails that we just absolutely love to read and then read out to the folks back on the podcast. People just get in touch with us, let us know what they feel about the show, that kind of thing. And I'd very much like that here. Any Only Fools fans out there, if you have the same opinions that I do, differing ones, stories about how you got into the show or what your favourite episode is and why, what things you may have wanted to get out of the show but never ultimately got, characters that you might have wanted to see more, literally anything you have to say about my show or Only Fools itself, please get in contact with me at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. I will get back in touch with you immediately and hopefully we'll be able to start a bit of a dialogue on the show, as of course this is made purely for and by the fans. If long form writing is not your thing, you can also get in contact with me on the Twitter, which is literally just at onlyfoolspodcast. Do expect the Twitter activity to be on the increase now, anyone who's already involved with that, as I now finally, after 2 months of using my dad's old Nokia, finally have a 21st century touchscreen phone again with things like internet. So now I'll be able to give it with the hectic upkeep that is maintaining a Twitter profile. You can find this show on things like Podomatic, but more importantly you can find us on iTunes. iTunes for some reason had this show listed as the Sam Wiles Show for some reason, not too sure about that one, but now after a few emails they've finally changed it to Only Fools and Podcasts. Woohoo! Any reviews you actually do on iTunes would be much appreciated. That allows the show to be bumped forward up in people's queues and stuff, get the show out there. Obviously I want as many Only Fools and Horses fans to hear this as possible. If you don't like listening to it or downloading it specifically on things like podcast apps and that, you can also find us on YouTube. Just type in Only Fools and Podcasts on there. Soon, just like my other podcast, I'll be doing the odd bonus episode where I may get friends, that kind of thing, just to chat all things Only Fools. Just basically any little snippets that I can't really fit into the format of one of these episodes. Also, after I finish the aforementioned other podcast, I will also be beginning a blog, probably on WordPress, something like onlyfoolspodcast@wordpress.com or onlyfoolspod@wordpress.com, that kind of thing, where basically it will just feature occasional articles, other reviews, and just be a hub for all the episodes to be collated together in one place, and essentially just be kind of the beacon that I'd like people to go to when they look at this show. Anyway, the last 2 weeks we've been looking at Del Boy and the actor who plays him, David Jason. So no awards for anyone out there who may have been guessing what I might be doing for my little digression this week. Of course I'm going to be discussing the character of Rodney Charlton Trotter. So why do I like Rodney, and who is Rodney? Rodney's a young man. He's between 13 and 15 years younger than Del, depending on which episode you're listening to. And this of course means he is very much reliant on Del. He is not an independent character. I wouldn't say he's like a limpet, he's not like overly attached, he does want to break free, but essentially he's kind of stuck both socio-economically and just socially in the life that he's now in. Rodney is a little bit more slapstick than Del, in the sense that he is the little brother. He's there to be constantly foiled and humiliated. His hopes and dreams are always comedically dashed before our eyes, and his dreams are a little probably more grander in scale than Del's, but also a bit more philosophical. Like, he just wants to be his own man, he wants to be a man of the world, he wants to be respected in the worlds of intelligence rather than, say, the world of face or respect, that kind of thing. He is also the supposed, like we've discussed before, the moralistic centre of the show, whereas Del will always be a little bit more close to an amoral character, someone who will always be out for his own ends. Rodney will always be there to counteract that, to say, is this right? I can't believe you're doing that. What the hell are you doing? This is illegal. But also, like we've discussed before, not only is he not malleable in the sense that Del can outwit him, he's also still a victim of, to a lesser degree, his own greed. Rodney is pretty much my demographic in terms of what the show's appealing to. I do feel like, as a 23-year-old myself, that I've gone through much of what Rodney has done and what he feels. He's idealistic about the world. He doesn't understand why things are as bad as they are. He thinks he can change the world. He's very hopeful in that way. He'll raise money for whales, or he talks about nuclear war, banning the bomb. He's not a fan of government, that kind of thing. But whereas Del will try and take advantage of it, Rodney's a bit more utopian in his mind. He tries to make sure that tomorrow will be better, whereas Del's trying to just make sure today's okay, really. I also compare myself to Rodney in the area of love and romance. Rodney, again, he's not sure of himself. He doesn't know really who he is or what he is. I'm not saying he doesn't have a personality, but he's always trying to find out who he is. And maybe that sort of automatic self-confidence that Del had to get to make sure that he could look after Rodney and Grandad is not there in Rodney purely because it's so there in Del. He's always relied on Del, so he's never had to be his own man. And now that he's growing up and his body's telling him, his mind's telling him that he wants to be his own man, he still doesn't really know how to do it. With women, Rodney doesn't have that thing that makes him him, so that he can show that off. He can't really sell himself. And whilst, I've never smacked a woman's bottom in public, nor have I worn a gladiator costume to try and arouse a partner, I still relate to Ronnie's futile attempts to attract the opposite sex, but also his futile attempts just to fit in with the gang. I myself, most of my friends are a couple of years older than me, just a weird thing that happened at school. We only really see Jevon and Mickey Pierce, and that's only in later seasons, of being people who are actually Rodney's age. All the people that Rodney actually hangs out with are people like Boise and Trigger and Denzel, all people who are more in Del's age demographic. So Rodney's always trying to be cool to fit in with these more experienced, I don't want to say well-read, but more well-versed members of society. And that's why we can get behind Rodney. He's always striving to prove himself. And, we kind of can believe that he can prove himself. We always root for him. We always want him to not make the stupid decisions that he does, because we know that there is some potential in him. And whilst having, 2 GCEs or 2 GCSEs in maths and art isn't really anything that amazing, the fact that just someone from this working class family that really has amounted to nothing really has got some qualifications. He'll rather unscrupulously get a computer qualification. He ends up working for Cassandra's father. He starts making a name for himself. The fact that he does do that, and we do see him rise out of the ashes, not like a phoenix, but like a little ember bird. He doesn't become a millionaire, but he does show that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps with nothing more than intelligence and motivation, and at least carve some sort of life out for yourself. But also, as audience members, we can be quite selfish. Not only do we want Rodney to succeed and get out from under the thumb of Del, we do realise that, even if it's just subconsciously, that the best part of the humour of this show is the status quo. Even when Rodney's well into his 30s and early 40s and he's still stuck under the thumb of Del, that's great for us, but it's not that good for Rodney, really. He will always act as the logical half of the Trotter partnership as well, claim he's things like an accountant or a business manager, that kind of thing, whereas Del will at least seemingly be like the more hot-headed of the two, making rash decisions, on-the-spot buys, and this gives a lot more emotive impact when Rodney is more emotional. Rodney still is very petty, especially with things with Del. He's still very prideful in that kind of immature way. What I also like is that he does indulge in things like binge drinking and smoking a bit too much reefer. Rodney's not a perfect character, and perhaps he does espouse that kind of a sense of holier than thou. He does look down upon Del a little bit, which isn't totally fair. Del isn't perfect either, and Rodney does have that young meta quality where he's able to both review himself, where the future's going, and look at the generation before him. He does have many examples of Del's generation, the generation before him, in his life, so he can see what they've done wrong and what he's trying to do better. As one little aside, I do appreciate that he does in fact have a fetish Like, wow, someone on the BBC has a sexuality? That's not just missionary wham bam thank you ma'am. Whilst it's never outright called a fetish, and it is still a pretty tame one, well, it's not exactly whips and chains with Madame Belvedere in the dungeon, but at least he's unique in that sense. And what's even more refreshing is that he's not really ashamed of it. He will get the occasional jibe for it, but that doesn't stop him from going out and getting what he wants, which again is very admirable. Rodney, in essence, is a character that we both admire and pity at the same time. He is forever stuck with Del. Del will never let him go, because Del can never risk the thought of losing Rodney, as Rodney is, at least until Damien comes, the closest thing he'll ever have to a son, despite the fact that he is his brother. Del, like all parents, has to go through that horrible transition of both guiding a youngster, but also letting that youngster make some mistakes for himself. And Rodney, being the plonker that he is going to make plenty of them. So, how was the character of Rodney Charlton Trotter incepted? Well, on that subject of how his character came to be, John Sullivan said, "Rodney reminded me of myself when I was young. I was a dreamer and an idealist, just like Rodders. There was this kid in school who had 2 GCEs and went around acting like he was Einstein. Whenever there was an argument, he'd behave like his 2 GCEs automatically made him right. I thought that was pathetic. I used that idea for Rodney, who was so proud of his 2 O-levels. On one hand, Del would use them to praise him because he was so proud that someone in the family had actually passed exams, and on the other hand, he'd send him up because of them." He went on to say, "I knew a couple of guys as well. One is a fellow who works for me now. A mate of mine from my old street. He's got a brother who's about 12 years older than he is, and the brother naturally guided him and led him and looked after him. If you think about it, Rodney's actually quite similar to the character of Wolfie, the main character in Citizen Smith, the show he did obviously before Only Fools and Horses, who is also a very idealistic, politicised young man trying to change a very indifferent world around him." David Jason was talking about Rodney and Del's relationship, and he said, "At first, Rodney was the younger brother who relied on Del to be fed. So Del was a breadwinner who had to go out and earn money to put food on the table. As they got older, we see them bickering like all families do. It was usually something about Rodney not wanting to carry boxes or be a lookout. It then became a battle of wits with Del trying to turn it all around to manoeuvre the situation to make Rodney feel important, which is always a key thing, really. Not only are there countless scenes where Del will turn away and know he can manipulate Rodney into doing things, but he also knows that Rodney is always trying to break away from him. Rodney does want to be a bigger man within the company. He does want to be, to some extent, Del. He wants to be a proper trader and to be making his own money, especially since Del only splits it down the middle 60-40. But despite the fact how often Del manages to outwit Rodney, he also went on to talk about how Rodney might not be as dippy as you think. Del would usually con Rodney, and after a while, he'd started to see through Del, but rather than say, 'up yours,' he basically just does what Del asks. It's his loyalty to Del, I suppose." Nicholas Lyndhurst, obviously the actor who we'll be talking about next week, who plays Rodney, he said, "There's a very strong bond between him and Del, and if the chips were down, Rodney would die for him." And I think that's very, very true. We even saw it in the last episode, Cash and Curry, when Rodney thought Del was being accosted and he'd been kidnapped by Mr. Rahm and his bruiser. He came in, running in, essentially gun blazing. He was like he was ready for a fight. Del is one of the few things in his life that can make Rodney brave, it seems. And though he'll never really tell Del how grateful he truly is for looking after him, it's very much unspoken between the two. Lyndhurst went on to say, "He's very much an innocent and quite sheltered from the real world, and had always had his older brother to look after all the real nasties. I was, and probably still am, quite awkward and gawky, and I accentuated that for the character. I also base him on the younger brother of a friend of mine who was always trying to be cool and failed miserably, and you see that a lot with young blokes." Again continued, "There's no real wonder as to why Rodney never got his own enterprise off the ground. After all, who was his role model? It was Del Trotter, and he's not really a great success. Poor Rodney was bound to fail." Yeah, he would finish up by saying, both in terms of Rodney's relationship with women, and I suppose just in things like work, finding himself, and becoming a man. The trouble with Rodney is he is in a perpetual state of puberty, and that's the key. Like Jason, Nicholas Lyndhurst obviously has had a real ability to see right through the character of Rodney and pick out what the key element is, and I think that is it. Rodney has never really grown up. He is a bit of a man-child, a bit of a Peter Pan. I mean, he never actually got to graduate university, so maybe perhaps that's also another part of it. He's never had that official welcoming into adulthood, especially since he was kind of thrown into it as well when both his parents walked out on him, though Del probably had this to a much greater and much more real degree. In terms of the look of Rodney, In the early days, Rodney was rarely ever seen without his green camouflage combat jacket, which was from the BBC stock department, and then costume designer Phoebe de Gay, who gave Del his camel hair coat and flat cap and stuff, and his jewellery, added the Yasser Arafat type headscarf, which he bought at a market in Shepherd's Bush. She described Rodney as looking grungy before grunge became fashionable. Lyndhurst said, "I soon got rid of the scarf though, purely because it kept getting in the way." It's weird though, because Rodney kind of has the least iconic outfit out of any of the characters on the show, and he doesn't have a look by the time we meet him. Keeping him with that perpetual state of puberty, of perpetually trying to grow, it makes perfect sense, as he's always trying to find this look, but has his own, youthful trepidation and immature self-doubt. And it means he tries all sorts of things. He doesn't have Del's camel hair or braces, nor Grandad's hat, or Albert's vests, so he has a multitude of looks instead to reflect his changing nature. There's the Greek combat jacket, like we've said, the big parka, the leather jackets, the burgundy cardigans, and the lumberjack checkered shirts. Now, not only does this show Rodney's progression, or thereof lack of progression of character, it also breaks up a bit of the visual staleness that character costumes can have in a sitcom, especially when Del has such a defined look. But as the show goes on, Rodney's dress sense will show some progression with the character. When he grows up a little and he does go and get his job, like with Cassandra's dad, he will most likely be seen to be in his cheap and then eventually a little more expensive grey suits, which actually always stick out in my mind as being stained with tomato juice rather hilariously. This era shows his outer maturity in the adult world, like he's attempting to almost infiltrate the adult world whilst knowing he's still a boy, and it contrasts wonderfully with his own inner immaturity, especially in his relationship with Cassandra and just everything about growing up, being responsible in your own home, moving out, raising a family. All of these things Rodney doesn't take to like a fish out of water nearly as well as Del did, but Del had to, and that's the point. All in all though, especially as a young man, Rodney is a character that the one I relate to, but most reluctantly. I don't particularly want to be Rodney, but through a lot of the genius writing of John Sullivan and the pathos that comes out of that, I really do see a lot of myself in him, whether I want to or not. And this kind of self-reflection that Rodney brings onto a younger audience does make him a lot more relatable, and that's genius writing, isn't it? But anyway, I've been talking about this too long. People have come here to talk about the episodes themselves. We are talking about the second time around. This is episode 4, season 1. It was transmitted on the 29th of September 1981. It's about 30 minutes long and had viewing figures of about 7.8 million people. And when you consider that there were about 4 televisions in the UK back then, that's pretty good numbers. So we open on a marketplace, which is always fantastic for me. Del and Rodney are at work as usual, flocking naff handkerchiefs to the market crowd. They both are making rather humorous comic banter with the crowd, which in turn is funny for us. And whilst I do think these scenes are better when they have a little more room to breathe and more of an interesting product to sell, maybe to humiliate Rodney, and just to give them a bit more crowd interaction, they still channel that unique market stall charm and banter that they need to, and it sets off the episode with a great tone. Del then decides that he needs a lemonade for his sore throat, so he lets Rodney know that he's going to the Nag's Head. On the way, Rodney asks him to pick up for him a packet of pork scratchings, or pork rinds as they're known in the States. They are a horrible snack made out of pig skins rendered in fat. So, into the Nag's Head, and Del pops in for his lemonade and bumps into his old pal Trigger in his second appearance in the show, the first recurring actor outside of the Trotter family. Del buys Trigger a pint and immediately gets himself a blackcurrant and Pernod, which is decidedly a little more alcoholic than just a lemonade, isn't it, Del? Now, I'm not sure whether the audience laugh here is because Del cheekily purchases alcohol, or the fact that he pronounces Pernod as Pernod. Trigger then tells Del that he's seen one of his old ex-girlfriends, a fiancée in fact. This is going to become a staple plot line of the show and a continual running gag. How many women has Del bought rings for, how many old girlfriends and fiancées has Del had, and it'll become common knowledge that Del will just have this long string of exes. Trigger tells him that it was Pauline Harris, much to Del's disbelief, claiming she got married to that Bobby Fincher and moved abroad. Looking across the bar, Del sees her. He looks both shocked and elated, like he's seen the best ghost of his life, and he wishes they had some emergency cheap aftershave on him. Trigger gives us the first clue in this episode as to Del's past relationship with this woman, telling Del, "You don't want to get involved with her again." Remember what happened last time? Del chooses to ignore this and simply asks if she's been asking about him. Joycey, the not Mike barmaid, claims that she actually has been, specifically asking how much Del has been earning. Del sees this through rose-tinted glasses as a sign of concern upon her part, but to us is now the second warning sign, that she may be in fact after more than just Del's affections. Del declares he's too shrewd to get involved with that lark again, but dissatisfied with how his friends are acting and with his smell, coyly makes his way over anyway. He greets Pauline, who immediately gives him a massive passionate kiss on the lips. This obviously disorientates Del and his plan, and in an instant he becomes very lovey-dovey from here on out. Now both their lips are coated in blackcurrant and Pernod, so she wipes it off for him with little handkerchiefs and gives him another little kiss. Del then looks back over his shoulder at Trigger, who whilst being dim is no fool, and looks back over at Del in abject horror and confusion, which is quite a reversal actually. Normally people are looking at Trigger in abject horror and confusion. So it's established that Del and Pauline haven't seen each other in at least 12 years. She tells Del that she got a job as an air hostess in San Francisco after her husband Bobby Finch died. Pauline is shocked that Del didn't know, but is also quick to see if Del also has a partner of his own. A smitten Del is interrupted by a timely "Where's my pork scratchings?" from a disgruntled Rodney, who now towers over the two of them. After claiming distraction, Del introduces, or should I say reintroduces, the pair. Pauline is rather unfamiliar with Rodney, as it was only a nip at the last time she saw him, but oh, Rodney does remember her. He's obviously very unenthused at the prospect of her company once again. It emerges that Bobby Finch is actually one of 2 husbands now that have snuffed it in Pauline's company, which Rodney sarcastically mocks. Pauline goes to powder her nose, and in typical childish fashion, Rodney begins deriding her as soon as she's out of earshot, pointing out Del's over-eagerness to please her once again. Del wonders why he's so hostile towards her at all, though. Rodney says he remembers how badly she screwed him up when they were first engaged, and Del brushes it off as merely happening a long time ago. That they are more mature now, and the only reason she left him at all was because they were mods and Bobby Fincher happened to have a faster Vespa scooter than Del did. Rodney scoffs. Del then berates Rodney because what does he know, as he only has animal urges. Now, as we've said before in our little digression, over the course of the show we will see that Rodney can be a little immature with women. But one thing that has never changed over the show was how Rodney can, when he's not directly involved in a situation, can have more of an objective opinion. Del does have a tendency to get rather lost in women, and Pauline won't be the last. But as per usual, Del's big, silly, trusting heart, Rodney's age and status as a younger brother, means that Del is never likely to listen to Rodney in these situations. Rodney scoffs again when Del claims to be a very sensitive person, and I think Rodney is very much in the wrong here. As we shall see over the course of the entire series, as well as this podcast, Del is anything but unemotional. Del, unfortunately, at his core, is a rather lonely person. After the death of his mother, he had been left with a very large gap in his life, and ever since then he's been trying to fill that emotional void with something, anything. Now, I don't think his dad walking out at him had the same kind of emotional impact on him as his mother did, and he's never really short of any male company. But what we do see is that Del is utterly desperate for a sense of female stability in his life that was taken from him when he was so young. And a desire for the same kind of strong female presence means he will dive blindly head first into these kinds of relationships because he feels like he can't wait. He's so desperate to have this presence that he will declare love on the first date, get engaged on the second, and probably be broken up with them by the third. The fact that his mother was so perfect in his eyes also probably doesn't help, meaning that until someone like Raquel, no one would ever be able to live up to her. Rodney then warns Del one last time not to get involved with her. Del says he knows Rodney's only trying to help and advise him, but he can shove it. Back in the flat, we cut to a familiar sight in the Trotter household. 2 televisions and Grandad sat in his grubby chair. He is worried that Del has been out awfully long, but Rodney suggests leaving it a bit before checking the local morgues. Grandad then starts reminiscing about the last time Pauline was about in their lives, claiming that up until she arrived they'd been doing alright. Apart from their mum's death and their father walking out on them, of course. He says he'd never seen anyone change as quick as Del did when he met Pauline. It's here where a strange element of continuity actually works its way into the show. Grandad talks about how Del used to be somewhat more of a believer in God and always donated to a new church roof, mostly because he felt guilty about nicking the old one. Now this is clearly linked to the season 5 episode Miracle in Peckham, when it is repeated about how Del used to donate to a church roof fund, because he nicked an old one, which ends up leading rain to leak into the church, leading to the Miracle of Peckham. Now, whether Sullivan had this future callback in mind, or whether he was just watching this episode years later and decided to reincorporate it back into his work, is anyone's guess. But either way, he goes and bases a whole episode on this idea a few years later, and it fits and it connects and it creates a nice little niche of canon. Excellent stuff. Del bursts in, and for 2 episodes in a row now, he is absolutely blind drunk. Again, as I mentioned in the last episode, these scenes can tend to make me a little uncomfortable, but alas, Del is still somewhat young at this point, and is prone to occasional bouts of being drunk as a newt. There is a humorous little moment here, and a big laugh from the audience is when Del initially kicks open the door, and it slams right back into his red face. Now, the way I've always interpreted this moment is that the door is meant to bounce off Rodney's feet as he's lying on the sofa next to the door. But if you watch closely, you can see the artifice of the episode kind of unravel a little, as you can clearly see Nicholas Lyndhurst kick the door right back at Del. Perhaps they can never get it to bounce right. It's kind of charming in a way, because it kind of just shows the slapdash way these episodes were made on the cheap, and obviously things like this are not going to be nearly as obvious in later episodes. So yeah, now with a sore nose, a skew tie and a bottle of champagne in hand, Del slovenly enters. But he goes quickly back into uncontrollable celebration, even imitating roaring crowds as he goes. He announces that he and Pauline are due to be wed, and there's instantly an awkward silence in the room. Not before Rodney once again falls back into sarcasm. Del professes that he knows Rodney doesn't exactly like Pauline, but with big puppy dog, boyish, innocent eyes, he claims that it's still what he wants. Rodney begrudgingly goes to get some champagne glasses to half celebrate. Del then turns to Grandad, who isn't saying anything on the matter, but then he announces the best news of all. Pauline is coming to live with them in Nelson Mandela House. Grandad looks horrified by this, and Rodney immediately storms off into his room. This is one of the many examples where we'll see Del, despite his childlike best intentions and optimism, that the stresses and strains he can put on his family through his choices are ultimately very selfish. And the fact that he's always shocked by their reactions shows that he never really learns from these lessons, and shows a bit of immaturity upon his own part. Cut to a little while later, and we see Del tucking into a rather grubby looking dinner, one of many that will be now made for him. It even gets a few groans from the audience as well. It looks like he's suffering to eat it for someone, and we know it's definitely not Grandad. Rodney and Grandad look sullen in their chairs, and Rodney turns his head to reveal, of course, Pauline. She is sat reclined in Rodney's sofa doing her nails, and Rodney looks awkward as hell in the other chair. Instantly, her presence has affected the physicality, the feng shui of the room. It looks crowded. She obviously doesn't belong. Rodney then puts his feet up on the table, to Pauline's instant disapproval. She says she cleaned that earlier. When Rodney doesn't obey her command, she quickly turns to Del to lay down the law in her name. Del, after his rather dubious meal, still seems very chuffed, saying to Rodney how it was a very long time since they'd all had a steak that good. Rodney then reminds Del that he and Grandad in fact didn't have any steak, but corned beef instead. Del looks back to Pauline, who defends herself by saying she didn't move in to be a cook and cleaner for the Trotter family. She will only cook for Del. And only spent enough of the housekeeping money to get them corned beef in the first place, which I shouldn't have to say is nowhere near the same quality or price of steak. Del does somewhat begin to concede and tells Pauline that the housekeeping money that he gave her at the start of the week was in fact for everyone. But like she says, she got them corned beef. Del then tells Grandad that he likes corned beef, but Grandad grimaces and shrugs away. When Del asks what's wrong, Grandad tells him that Pauline has hidden his teeth. Del asks Pauline why she's hidden Grandad's teeth. She says while she's stuck in the flat, doing her nails and soddle else, Grandad is apparently nibbling all day long. But she's kind enough to give him them back at meal times for his corned beef. There's a brief little part here where we see, just in the expressions on David Jason's face, that he's beginning to question Pauline's decisions. But it's almost like he snaps himself out of any sort of logical state of mind. He relents and admits that she, in fact, knows best. He won't risk loneliness or contradicting or confronting her about anything, no matter the costs to him or his family.
Rodney not so subtly hints to Del that they should both go out for a drink, and they do a little pantomime of no, no, yes, yes. But Pauline interjects and suggests that Rodney take Grandad out as she'd like some alone time with Del, because she's bored watching telly with the three of them all night, every night. Rodney scoffs at this, as all Pauline and Del seems to do is spend alone time together, professing that giant pandas mate quicker than them two. Pauline is then shocked to find out that Grandad not only watches 2 TVs at the same time, but that he normally watches 3. She calls him senile, which washes over the two lads, as they just see it as part of Big Grandad's personality. Again, they don't outright say this, but it is implied perfectly. Then Pauline begins to work her own magic. She suggests putting Grandad into a home. This fires up a young Rodney, who adamantly insists that Grandad already has a home. So, since she can't get rid of Rodney or Grandad, Pauline then suggests that she and Del buy their own place instead. Then Del explains that the moment he actually puts his signature on any document, it will essentially ruin his no tax paying policy. She then suggests that they put the house in her name. Which to her wouldn't be strange, what with all the money she's got on the life insurance from her late husbands. She then coyly asks Del if he himself has a life insurance policy sorted out, as a wife needs protecting. Rodney then hints that with Pauline's previous luck with husbands, it's no wonder that she gets them life insurance. Pauline decides to call it another early night and drags Del and his cup of tea off back to the boudoir. Rodney and Grandad then kind of convey through a weird hand gesture that I've never seen before that Del is, or I presume this means under the thumb. They kind of screw their thumb into their palm. Del tries to defend himself on this accusation, but Pauline sharply drags him off, once again spilling his tea everywhere. Next morning in the lounge, and Grandad is in his old dusty overcoat and watching his 2 TVs, but it's too early for anything to actually be airing on them. Yes, kids, there used to be a point whereby parts of the television schedule would mean there would literally be nothing on. Rodney storms in carrying suitcases and duffel bags and asks Grandad if he's ready to go. Rodney reminds Grandad not to get soppy, as they both agreed that they aren't wanted here anymore. They're going to leave forever before Del even wakes up. This is another example of Rodney's kind of overly grand gestures to try and test Del. He wants to force him to make a decision, this time over whether he loves Pauline or his own family more. Grandad convinces Rodney to at least say goodbye, but then Pauline comes rushing in with Del's breakfast. Rodney asks if Del is up and okay, but she says he had another rough night. Rodney goes to wake Del, but Pauline blocks his path, claiming that whilst that room that they sleep in was once Rodney's mum's room, it is definitely now hers, and she does not want him in there. When she asks if Rodney understands, he lets her know in a very childish Rodney way by saying, "Jawohl, mein Oppengruppen-Führer," which roughly translated means, "Yes sir, my greater leader." And I'm sure probably Rodney learnt this mostly from naff British World War II movies made after the war, rather than learning any actual German at school. And to top it all off, Rodney even adopts the Nazi salute. Now, hold on, before warning bells start ringing, I will admit right now that this is a little racy, even for 1980, but this is just, again, Rodney being very immature and very silly. He's basically trying to mock and undermine Pauline in the worst possible way without swearing on BBC Two. Yeah, he's basically calling her Hitler to her face, and she knows it. She tells him to act his age, which probably isn't the best thing to say to Rodney in this situation, if you think about it. Pauline then goes back to tend to Del, and Rodney, acting his own age, tells her to bite it as soon as she's out of earshot, again. He muses over poor Del and Pauline's supposed sexual torture chamber that was once the mom's bedroom. Grandad wonders about why Del's been looking so ill lately. Rodney notes that it's not for lack of food, as Pauline's been making him so much of it. But then Grandad reminds Rodney that it's a dicky bell that's been playing up Del. Trigger then rings on the phone, and Rodney calls out to Pauline to release Del, who then proceeds to enter. He looks shagged out and is wearing one of many future silly pairs of silk pyjamas. This one he's obviously stolen from a sauna called the Perfume Gardens. Pauline then pops off to put a deposit on a ring, go visit an estate agent, and then head off to the bank. She's a busy bee. Rodney gives her one more Nazi salute before heading out. From what we can tell from Del's end of the phone conversation, we can, see Del, despite, telling his friend Trigger that he won't be interfering and that he should speak freely, getting more and more exasperated with Trigger, who seems to be dancing around the subject of Pauline. Trigger then tells Del something rather shocking, and Del turns around and asks him to stop bloody interfering. Rodney sarcastically asks how Trigger was, and Del tells us the police had apparently investigated the death of Pauline's last husband. Bobby Fincher, the guy on the moped, apparently died of food poisoning. Grandad reminds Del that his breakfast is getting cold. Del shrugs it off and he says he'll seek them after his medical. Rodney then counters this and tells Del that he won't be seeing them at all, as he and Grandad are leaving and that they'll be forming their own business partnership. Del laughs this off, claiming that Grandad is the only living person to ever be treated for rigor mortis. Look, we've never seen Grandad actually trading before. We've never seen him actually doing any work before, so I don't know how much of this is Rodney's real plan or just part of his weird test for Del. Rodney tells them they're off to Auntie Rose's in Clacton, and Del, in his prideful own immaturity, sends them packing, even mocking the idea that Pauline will be returning shortly with some deadly nightshade. Rodney, as a last comment, tells Del to eat his mushrooms. Del then calls after Rodney, who shouts that they're not coming back. Del then hollers back to them that he's actually coming with them. I am really glad that Del chose his family here, but it's important to distinguish that this could be more seen as an action made equally out of self-preservation than out of any family devotion, so Del's not really off the hook in my eyes here yet. So the three-wheel van pulls up outside of Auntie Rose's in Clacton, and the three clamber out of the three-wheeled monstrosity. Del swiftly making his way over to the door, and the other two get all the gear. At the door, Auntie Rose answers, and Del gives her a big old kiss and says that she must be so surprised to see them. The spirits are clearly high. The three saunter on into Auntie Rose's with all their stuff, and Del sits himself down, making himself very comfortable indeed, even changing over the TV channel as there's racing on at 2:30. Cut to later that night, and the three of them are all having a wonderful shepherd's pie dinner in the living room. Rodney then asks Del what he's going to write to Pauline. Del begins to recite to Rodney what he's put in his eviction notice to her. My dearest Pauline, the engagement's off, the wedding's off, and as you can gather from this letter, I'm off. I'll give you 5 clear days to get out of the flat, and do not ever come back, you money-grabbing old murderess. All my love, Del Boy. He claims it wasn't exactly as nice as that, but that's the general gist. Once again, this hints at the anything but PC language and rampant swearing that obviously would take place off camera in the real world of Only Fools and Horses. As Rodney wonders what Pauline will be doing to the flat in their stead, Auntie Rose enters the room, asking whether everyone is full or not, to which they all politely compliment her on her hosting and cooking skills. Del then pops some housekeeping money into her apron for her to look after them, which again, it does show that sort of Del Boy generosity and clearly conveys why everyone likes him so much, as he never wants to put anyone out. She then stops and asks Del if she can ask one simple question, to which Del says yes, of course. And she says, "Who are you?" Now there are some great classic sitcom reaction shots from Del and Rodney here, and with all the previous kindness and assumptive behaviour towards her, it just acts as a great idiotic twist, and it feels like it has been a while since these two cocked something up, so it's a great reveal. Rodney then lays it on extra thick for us when he says, "You mean we've been in your house for 5 hours, had all your shepherd's pie, had a bath each, and you don't even know who we are?" Basically, she didn't want to ask, as they all seem to know her. Del then tries to help her remember that she was at Joan and Reg Trotters' wedding back in 1947, and that she said 33 years ago that they could all come over at any time. Rose claims to have never known a Joan or even been to Peckham, but it is revealed that the real Auntie Rose had moved many years ago, much to the shock of our heroes. So who the hell is this then? However, she mentions a woman named Joni Hollins and her Jamaican husband, and they basically do take this old lady for a ride, claiming to be the children of this couple instead. Both out of, not wanting to upset or frighten her, rock the boat, but they also don't want to leave her comfortable abode and go back to the killer flat either. So everyone's a winner, in a sense, even though neither party have any idea who the other are. They claim they were adopted. This is probably one of the oddest moments in the Trotters' career of exploiting people, because again, no one's really harmed. It's almost like they're in too deep to pull back out now, so they may as well just ride it out. And again, it's not like they're putting her out. Seeing as how there is no one else in the house, and this may be a bit assumptive on my part, but I'm sure Auntie Rose is glad to have the company. She offers them some apple pie, and Del gives her a great big kiss again. Cut to outside the Trotters' flat, and they are cautiously tiptoeing up to outside the front door. Del is still nervous that a jilted Pauline may still be in the flat brandishing a flick knife like Psycho in a tower block. So he devises a plan to have each of them rush into different parts of the flat and take her by surprise if necessary. So, like something out of a World War II para-regiment film, Del sounds the charge and forces the other two into the flat, leaving out the part where he also goes into the flat with them, closing the door and kind of leaving Rodney and Grandad to their fates. So then Del finally does decide to come into the flat and stick his nose in, but the actual great bit about this scene is that whilst Grandad is supposedly checking the kitchen, you can clearly see Leonard Pierce standing by the kitchen door waiting for his cue to enter. This is probably the first of the major gaffes in the show, and this is, on the level of that bit in Jurassic Park when you can see one of the velociraptors entering the kitchen and a man's hand is clearly balancing the model. Like, it's a real cock-up. But, it gives me the same joy of, breaking down the artifice of filming and filmmaking, and you can just see how this is just a bunch of people coming together to make something, and just seeing them make it, and they've cocked up a little bit here. It does add a bit of an earnest charm, because we know that they wouldn't intend to do something like this. But again, this is cheap, this is being made quickly, and they're all relatively new at this. So, when Grandad and Rodney return from their marks, they remark about how undamaged the place is. Turns out Pauline has cleaned and hoovered everything and left rather peacefully. But Del is still too suspicious to be calm, stating that Pauline wouldn't leave without doing something really nasty to him. Rodney then spots a letter left for Del, or as Pauline puts it, that no-good, lying, two-faced creepo. After Del reads the letter, Rodney asks if Pauline ever meant that much to him in the first place. And Del, he kind of shrugs it off, but not a second later, he gets rather solemn and questions whether he's really up for the falling in love game. Again, it just shows that softer side to Del. We've moved past that laddish bravado, and there is this rather human character on the inside, within the privacy of his own family. Rodney then confesses, out of pure guilt, that it was in fact he and Grandad who put Trigger up to phoning Del with the story of food poisoning. For a moment we actually feel like Del is actually enraged by all of this, but it turns out he's just feigning it to pull their legs a little. He instantly forgives the two, as he probably realises it wasn't the best move for him after all. Grandad, on his way to the kettle, suddenly notices that the phone is in fact off the hook, and he goes to answer it. It turns out Pauline had dialed the speaking clock in America. Again, for all you young kids, the speaking clock is a service whereby you would dial a number and the phone would actually tell you what time it is. Even though things like watches had been invented, apparently just not enough people had them for this service to not be available. Grandad absolutely marvels at the American accent on the other end before Del and Rodney scream at him to hang it up, to end the absolutely massive telephone bill. Cut to credits. Okay, so this is essentially just the first of many episodes where it's either Del being manipulated by a woman or a woman from Del's past returning to mess up his present and future. It will become a staple of the show that we will come to love in later years, but the fact of the matter here is that this is a first stab at this kind of story, and it will sadly be done much better and polished in other episodes later on down the line. Episodes that come to mind for me are things like Happy Returns, what else? Yesterday Never Comes, Diamonds Are for Heather, etc. And we even have another possible murderess in Fatal Extraction. Now, I'm generally not trying to detract from this episode at all. I for one have fond memories of this episode growing up, having the entire series on DVD and being the chronologically minded kid that I was. I am in fact well versed in season 1, so if anything, I'm probably more critically biased towards it than I'd actually like. The stuff with Auntie Rose, if rather brief, is great. I do love the way Del becomes such an effortless patsy in the hands of this woman. I love how honest and heartfelt Rodney's reaction to this is. It just shows that real kinship between the two. And as I've said before, any episode that features the Trotters in the markets doing what they do best will always have a soft spot in my heart. Let's be honest, it does sag a little in the middle. It does suffer, again, not its fault, but it does suffer from not having the 50-minute format of later episodes, giving it that rushed season 1 feel. And however unfortunate, retroactively, this type of episode is going to quickly get perfected, making this one look a little stale and laughless by comparison. You know what, is it just me, or has season 1 barely had any Grandad in it so far? So, time for my arbitrary numerical rating. I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. Once more, I'm trying to avoid things like saying it's not good, it's not bad, because I don't particularly dislike most of season 1. It's just that it really doesn't stand out or pop the same way later seasons will. It's a great effort, Sullivan, but come back next time, hone the craft a little, and we'll see what happens. Lovely jubbly. So, once again, that was Only Foursome Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Like I say, I've been trying to get a bit more regimented with the release schedule for these things. Things keep happening, yada yada yada. You don't exactly want to hear the ins and outs of the behind the scenes of this show, but importantly, I hope you're enjoying listening to these shows as much as I am making them, as it is the best excuse ever for both me and you to go back and watch the show. So, everyone's a winner really. But that's all for now. I've gone far too long with this episode. Please join us again next time, and we will be exploring one of the least well-received episodes, I think, in Only Fools history, and I might actually give defending it a bit of a try when we review A Slow Bus to Chingford. I'm Sam Wiles, and you've been listening to Only Foursome Podcast, and don't forget, this time next year, we'll have 1 million downloads.
No money back. guarantee.